You're at the Coaching Inn, 3D Coaching's virtual pub, where we enjoy conversations with people who are engaged in the world of coaching.
Roger Steer says that ethics is in everything. And that's true, especially in coaching. The International Coach Federation talk about how we understand and consistently apply coaching ethics and standards of coaching. So the question for this recording is, how do we strengthen our ethical lens around our work? I'm Claire Pedrick, and in 2020 and 2021, 4 practitioners joined me at our Coaching In podcast on iTunes and Apple Podcasts to share their insights. We've edited these together in this ethics special so that you can use it to strengthen your ethical lens. You can use this as 3 hours self-study in ethics for ICF renewal, and if you're doing your full coaching training with 3D coaching, you can use it as 3 hours training on the ICF core competencies. Let's start with the challenge, and that is, because coaching can feel like so many different other kinds of conversations, we need to be super clear on what we do and what is outside our remit. The words from the ICF say that a coach maintains the distinctions between coaching, consulting, psychotherapy and other support professions, and refers clients to other professionals as appropriate. So I guess the question is, what does that look like? I've been coaching for about 30 years, and I'm particularly interested in ethics and mental health, because one of the beliefs that we have is that the people we coach are robust enough to deal with their own stuff, unless it turns out they're not. And that's been a really good ethical lens for me for many years. But the question I'm left is this: how do I know if they're robust enough or not? What needs to happen for coaching to be safe enough for me, safe enough for the person who comes for the conversation, and safe enough for the different worlds that we inhabit? Our first guest in this recording is Jenny Forge. She's been a psychiatrist for many years and is now a professional certified coach. In fact, she has a book coming out in 2022 called Coaching in Mental Health Service Settings, Practical Applications. And I'm sure we'll have her back at the Coaching Inn to talk about that. But let's listen to what she has to say. So I'm really curious, as we start this conversation, to hear from you about where the ethics of coaching fit with the ethics that you have in psychiatry.
Hi, Claire. Hello. Well, starting with the ethics of clinical psychiatry, I see 4 main areas really, which I think would apply with coaching as well, and apply in all aspects of life really, which is as far as we can, don't do harm, try to do good, promote people's autonomy, and be fair and just. And I think that, as I say, that fits across the board.
Try to do good. That's interesting, isn't
it? Yeah, tricky one. I suppose maybe thinking of it in terms of suffering, try to promote a lack of suffering, which I guess is maybe on a par with doing good. But yes, all these things are often easier said than done. But I think that once we develop an awareness about what we're doing, we're more likely to follow a better path.
Yeah. So what does an awareness look like for you as a psychiatrist and a coach?
Again, I think similarities between both professions. Awareness is... Did you say what's awareness? What does awareness look like?
Yes. What does awareness of these things?
Yes. I think it's about listening to what's going on in your mind, listening to what's going on in your own body as you listen to that person and as you receive cues from the person that you're speaking to, some of which are going to be verbal, some of which are going to be non-verbal. And it's a constant readjustment and trying to remain in tune with the relationship in the moment, really. I don't know whether that fully says it. Does that make sense, Claire?
It does. So it's something about presence.
Yes.
And it's something about stance.
Yes.
And I guess it's something about our internal self-supervisor voice.
Yes. And it's an openness and a flexibility to what's happening. So it really requires a high level of attention, I would say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which makes the metaphor for coaching about it being a dance,
yes,
being a really useful one because of all the things that we're noticing.
Yes, yes. And I'm just reminded of an exercise that we did in one of your training courses, Claire, where we were in pairs and we mirrored the movement of the other person without any prior knowledge of what that person was going to do. And I was really clear that promoted high level of awareness and in-tuneness. So that's what I'm referring to really there.
Which is a challenge if we like control.
Very much so, very much so. And I think that in terms of some of the differences between working in mental health and working as a coach, and I certainly there I would say that there is an overlap and there is an interchangeability, but I think you need to know where you are and be explicit about what kind of approach you're adopting.
So it's about which hat you're wearing.
Very much so. And I think that the hat that you're wearing needs to be clear to both the wearer of the hat and the person that you're with. And I think that it also probably requires, when you change hats, it's both about informing the person that you're wanting to change hats and seeking permission to do so. The range of states of mind that somebody will come to see a mental health professional in is very varied. And sometimes people will feel that they're quite okay and they're robust enough for a more coaching approach, and at other times they won't feel that. And I think that there has to be something considered about a power dynamic, because I know that power isn't necessarily a very palatable word to hear there, but when a mental health professional is working with somebody who is very poorly, there is a sense that the person who is poorly is saying, please help me, tell me what to do, until I feel more able to kind of think more clearly and continue on my own. That's a different dynamic to the relationship between a coach and a person being coached.
Yeah.
But as I say, it's a complex area because there is a merging, but I think it requires an awareness of, what's happening.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, that thing about power and robustness? Because one of the ways I like to think about ethics is that I believe the person I'm working with is robust enough to deal with their own stuff, unless they're not.
Yes.
And so part of this conversation is about the not, I guess, isn't it? But also the thing about power is one of the things that I've noticed increasingly is that coaches who are good at not taking the power and at really sharing the responsibility and making it a partnership also need to pay attention when the person they're working with gives them the power.
Yes.
Because if you give me the power, I've got it, even if I didn't take it. Yes.
Yes. So again, that brings us back to the awareness, doesn't it? And I think that there's a big movement in mental health over recent years, which I think is really the way that we all have to go, which is a model called the recovery model, which much more explicitly is about working in partnership with people who are suffering with mental health difficulties. It's very much about collaborative goal setting. It's about hope. It's about agency. It's about opportunity. And those things work with a coaching approach, but there is this whole area that when somebody is really poorly in terms of their mental health, they're not in a position to think clearly. I know I'm maybe repeating myself here, but there's something about it, the ICF conference that we went to recently, Claire, and Dr. Laura Watkins was talking about how the mind is sometimes in protect mode and sometimes it's in explore mode. When somebody's suffering with an acute mental health condition, they're much more likely to be in protect mode.
Okay.
And that's an important consideration.
So that's a useful checking thing. Am I noticing protect or am I noticing explore?
Yes. I don't know whether I quite addressed your question there, but do you want to ask me again and see if I can?
The thing about power and robustness.
Yes, and I think you can always ask. Sorry to interrupt, but I think you can always ask somebody how robust they are feeling.
Yes.
Or how okay are you feeling at the moment?
Yeah.
And check in with people. And since I've become a more experienced coach, the nature of my mental health consultations has shifted a great deal. And it always, so for example, yesterday I was in clinic, and it always surprises me how surprised people are when I actually ask them, well, what do you want to achieve? What do you want to be different at the end of our hour together? What are the things that are most important for you in this meeting? And I think people sometimes have been conditioned to come and see doctors or mental health professionals and say, right, tell me what I've got to do, tell me what's wrong with me, give me a prescription. I know that's a huge generalization and a stereotype, but I think overall in health in general, not just mental health, we really need to have much more of a focus of moving away from the doctor telling the patient what they need to do and where they're going wrong, and much more about collaborative goal setting.
Yeah.
And I think that some of the big health problems that we have at the moment would be much better tackled in that way as a society.
Yeah, so that's interesting, isn't it? Can I just pick you up on a couple of things? You said it's great to say to somebody, how robust are you feeling at the moment? And we've talked before about the question that we need to be asking ourselves about how robust am I feeling at the moment?
Absolutely. Yes. And when we're in tune with ourselves, we're more likely to be in tune with other people. We're less likely to trip up on some of those things, sort of unconscious mechanisms of putting our feelings onto other people, assuming that they're feeling in a certain way, because actually that's more how we're feeling.
Yeah.
If we're actually aware of how we're feeling, we're less likely to do that, which again comes back to the whole issue of you need good supervision and needing to, know where you are, start where you are, know as far as you can where the other person is and start where they are.
That was very simple and straightforward, Jenny. But yeah, absolutely, the need for supervision is huge, and also the need for supervision that can give insights into those kind of blind spots.
Yes,
is a really useful thing.
Yeah, blind spot is the word. Yeah, and we've all got them. Yeah.
Absolutely. So I might be anywhere on my scale of robustuousness, from my least robust to my most robust. And what I'm hearing you saying is we need to also be paying attention to where is the person we're working with on their scale of robustness.
Yes.
They may be at the top of their scale or at the bottom of their scale.
Yes. And I think sometimes it can be very helpful to bring that out in the open, because it will help them to think about how robust they feel. Sometimes people who have a mental health problem, or particularly who've been traumatized, they're very used to putting on a brave face, or that they're not, people may, and when I'm saying about people with a mental health problem, I mean bearing in mind that quite a lot of the workforce, people who are employed, are suffering with a mental health problem. It really isn't a them and us. There's a real same boatness and a real spectrum about mental distress. But I think that if you explicitly say to somebody, well, how are you feeling? How are you really feeling? that enables them to access themselves in a different way sometimes. There are sometimes people who habitually will put on a brave face, and there are some people who habitually have a negative view that may need some, help in perhaps seeing a different way.
Yeah. So how are you feeling? And we've also used the question, how robust are you feeling?
Yes.
And I'm noticing that the robust one may give a different kind of data than the how are you feeling question.
Yes. I think it's more specific. And I think it can be useful to be a bit more specific, because when particularly you're wanting to tap somebody's robustness.
Yeah. It sounds like a temperature check, doesn't it?
Yes.
On your temperature scale, what's your robust temperature today?
Yes. And I think it is an assumption that the robustness temperature is going to fluctuate. I think we make a mistake if we feel that people become frozen in their robustness score, and it will fluctuate, quite substantially sometimes during the course of a session.
Yeah.
And it would be, ideally it would be a good thing if we could get to the end of a session and somebody would be able to feel that their robustness level was higher at that point.
Interesting. So you said earlier that mental health isn't just them, it's us, it's we, and we all have mental health, and many people in the workforce have mental health challenges or areas that they need to be paying attention to. So in some...
Sorry. I just wanted to say, Claire, I'm not trivializing, we all have mental health. There are well-being concerns for all of us.
Absolutely.
There are some people who are really suffering acute mental illness. Stress isn't the same as severe anxiety and severe depression. There is there clearly is a distinction, but there is a spectrum of well-being and mental health. But I'm really sorry, I interrupted you again.
That's what great conversations are about, Jenny. My question was going to be, can you coach somebody who's on medication? Because I know the ICF don't say anything about that, and yet there are some professional bodies that say you can't. My personal take is, if that was the case, I probably wouldn't be coaching anybody.
Yes, I think that the certainly SSRI medication, which is the commonest medication for treating anxiety, depression, obsessionality, is prescribed to a huge proportion of the population, people who are functioning well and have often taken this medication for a long time. That in itself opens up all sorts of questions and debates as to what we're doing as a society in relation to our use of antidepressants and anti-anxiety meds. But I would certainly say that being on psychotropic medication is not a reason that somebody shouldn't be coached.
So that comes from the psychiatrist herself?
Yes. One of them, yeah.
It's interesting, isn't it, Jenny, that you can't, that a set of rules or a set of whatever it is we think we're going to do around ethics in the moment, we need to decide in the moment what's the most ethical, what's the right thing to do. So what's your insights or advice around that?
Yes, well, I would definitely say that we need to take a pause and register what's happening both in our minds and in our bodies at that time, because I think as humans, our sense of what's right or wrong, what's wholesome or unwholesome to do, doesn't just come from our thought processes, but comes from our guts, from our feelings. And I think that we're well advised to take note of them in that situation.
Pausing. Pausing in service of the relationship and the conversation and the person that we're working with.
Yes.
I like that. I like pausing in service of our thinker.
Yes, and I think to cultivate a sort of permission for both the person and the coach to pause and have pauses throughout, because I think often in our everyday conversations, in our common parlance, and I'm certainly guilty of this myself, there isn't always sufficient pausing. There isn't always sufficient comfort with there being a silence. And I know that that's something that we've discussed before, but I think when we're faced with a tricky situation of what's the best thing to do, that's definitely worth a pause.
Yeah, I agree, because otherwise what I notice when I'm supervising coaches is that they get their insight in the room with me, and that serves them and their learning. But actually what we want to do as we mature in coaching is to be able to get the insight in the room.
Yes.
So that in the moment we know what's the right thing to do.
Yes.
Or the right enough thing.
Yes. And I think it's also worth, when there's been a pause, to capture what's happened in that, and then to sort of try and understand it and maybe note it down, because I think that can be very useful. And I think that when we feel stressed, which we do feel when we're facing an ethical dilemma, we need to be particularly attentive and restrained, and that is promoted by having a pause.
Yeah. I sometimes say to people, I'm just asking myself a question.
Yes.
About how this serves you and your team and your organization, or
yes.
whatever, so that it's that showing the working out principle, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, and it's the thing about the co-created partnership, that as long as my thinking is in service of our relationship and the work that we're doing together,
yes,
and not working out whether person A is really married to person B or whatever the
yes. And that's showing the working out thing is just so important. I think it really makes for an authentic connection as well. It's kind of it's an honest thing, isn't it? It's saying, if we are struggling with something, it's like, right, well, this is tricky, isn't it? And we're in this together. Let's think about what needs to happen now. So I think that's so important.
And if you go for the definition that I love, that coaching is two people talking about one person,
right?
Then that's that's a great thing.
Yes,
because it's two human beings in dialogue.
Yes, and to keep in mind that phrase that you said, sort of being in service of the other person. And I think sometimes being in service of the other person involves being in service of the other person and their context, and the system that the other person is in. So, for example, in a mental health consultation, you have the person that you're seeing, but you need to have consideration for their family, and the same, in a parallel coaching situation, maybe that you're thinking about the organization that the person works for, and that may actually be paying you. So I think that it is being in service of the person, being in service of their context as well.
Yeah.
And that in itself sometimes can raise a bit of an ethical issue.
Yes, and that's a huge thing, isn't it? Because traditionally we've said, this conversation is entirely confidential. This is about you in this context. But as you say, there are other stakeholders in the thing. So I wonder if it's useful for us just to talk about confidentiality. So one of the things that many coaches say to the people they work with is everything that happens in this conversation is confidential, unless there's a risk of harm to self or harm to others.
Yes.
So my question to you is, as a psychiatrist, how do we know that?
How do we know whether they're at risk of harm to themselves or others?
Yeah.
Well, again, I would say that it's that high level of awareness, because that kind of assessment about harm involves both what the person says and what we see and what we feel. So I think that probably as a coach, if you're a coach without a mental health background, you probably have to have a fairly low threshold for you need to know your limits, and you need to have a fairly low threshold for thinking, are we in tricky territory here, and what do I need to do? Having said that, I think that it is appropriate to get a little bit of background around that, because some people say things that they may not necessarily sort of really mean in a sustained way, and triggering some sort of action or breaking of confidentiality could potentially, be unnecessary and make things more difficult, cause more suffering. So it is always a balance, and I would just go back to this, really always trying to maintain a high level of awareness for what the coach themselves is capable of, what their experience and what their training is, and and their experience actually sort of generally in human life. I don't think it's a science. I think it's I'm repeating myself, but it's an in-tuneness.
In-tuneness.
Yes.
And you've given us a great question. Are we in tricky territory here, and what do we need to do about it?
Yes. Yes. And I think my experience is that people who have harbored thoughts about harming themselves, it often can be a relief to talk about it. It doesn't necessarily mean that because they've verbalized it, it makes them more likely to act on it. I think sometimes it is talking about that is really about the extent to which they're experiencing distress, and they really need to communicate that. But I would say, I obviously, erring on the side of safety, it is important really for coaches to know their limits, and if they have that sense that it needs to be taken further, taken elsewhere, then that needs to be out in the open. Again, show the working out, say, this is really concerning to hear this. We need to think about what we're going to do with what what you're feeling, and try and find the best way forward. Yeah.
And I can think of two examples for me. One in which I rang occupational health because that internal alarm system was so very high, and occupational health took over. And one where I put something in place to check in 24 hours later with the sponsor, where I said, do you know where you're going to find that? And they said yes. Yes. And I said, is it okay in 24 hours if I just, and they were going to get it through the sponsor. And I said, is it okay if in 24 hours I just call the sponsor and check that they've heard from you?
Yes. Yes.
My lurking question is that both of those people had come through a third party referring them and had not self-referred. And I always wonder what I would have done had they self-referred and I had not known anyone else in their world.
Yes, yes. And before we just follow on with that, Claire, just to understand a little bit about what was going on for you at the time that you were in those situations. So for example, you described that you were in that situation on a Friday, you were going to check in with the person on the Monday. Did it affect you over the weekend? Did you feel
it didn't affect me? And also they talked about it as a recent past event. Right. And they had done something about it, and they knew they needed to do some more about it.
Yes.
So that one, my checking in, I'm looking at your question, are we in tricky territory here and what do we need to do? I think my sense was there was the potential of tricky territory being around. It had been there, and it wasn't resolved enough for it not to be a risk that it came back in the immediate future. Right. But it wasn't so tricky that something instantly needed to be done.
Yes.
The other one was interestingly a relationship over a number of conversations where there had been no forward movement at all. So for me, one of my checking in thing has this person got the capacity to move forward, and are they demonstrating an ability to move forward, or are we constantly either standing still or going backwards over time? And that particular individual was that, and I can't remember what happened apart from the fact that it alarmed me sufficiently to believe that something needed to be done in the moment. And ironically, I just started working with a supervisor on my supervision, and they were the next person I spoke to. So guess what we spent the hour on?
Yes, and just having that hour fairly soon afterwards, did that make a difference?
It did. It made a huge difference, because I needed to work out, well, two things, I guess, as you asked me that, which I probably didn't know until you just asked me that question. One is, it wasn't too late to do something else. There was something else I needed to have done that I hadn't done.
Yes.
So that raises for me a question about accessibility to someone we can talk to in a timely way, actually.
Yes. Yes.
And the other one is, it is distressing to talk to somebody who doesn't seem to have the agency or the capacity to move, and is talking about their desire to end their life.
Yes.
And a place to take that is really important.
Yes. And I completely agree and recognize that feeling about, it's good to speak to somebody else in enough time that if you reflect on it and you think you need to do something different, that you've got enough time to do that. And I've been a consultant psychiatrist for 23 years. I still have that. I still feel often anxious, uncomfortable after I've had those conversations. So I think for coaches who are in receipt of some of this information, it's not going to feel comfortable, even if you discuss it with somebody, because this is big, distressing stuff. And even when we know that, we've done the right thing, we've done as best we can, we've sort of known our limits, we've made the appropriate referrals, there still is that lingering feeling of, should I have done something different? Have I done everything I can? And I think that even when we know logically we have, that's very often, in fact, practically always still there.
Yeah, because we're human beings.
Yes.
Talking to humans.
Yeah, and I definitely think that the option for talking these difficult situations over with somebody, a supervisor, or and sometimes it doesn't involve breaking any confidentiality, but this is something I've noticed, this is an aside really, but as the mental health system has become more pressured, we do less co-work as professionals, and I really feel that when you're working on your own, you feel the weight of that information more heavily. But yes.
Yeah, interesting. So when we work with people who come to us for coaching who have self-referred and haven't got a sponsor or an organisational connection with us, and we are feeling a high level of concern, what are our options?
Well, I would say in that situation, I would first of all ask the person, to seek their agreement about whether we need to do something. It may be that even if you don't have their agreement, you feel that you need to do something, and that that ratchets it up. But if you feel that you really need to kind of hold that person's hand through the process, it may be a case of speaking with family members, speaking with asking the person to speak to their GP, even asking them to make a call while you're there. I mean, I haven't had this in a coaching context, so it's a little bit difficult perhaps for me to think about taking off my psychiatrist hat and putting on that. But I would say that it probably makes sense for coaches to be aware of their local, although actually coaches often work with people who are a long way away, don't they? And maybe over the phone. So that adds in extra, or Skype, that adds in extra issues. But I would say that they're, GPs, mental health crisis teams, if, that those are the kinds of services that I think if you really concern somebody has a clear mental health problem, you need to be trying to connect them with those people, but probably in the first instance, family and friends. But there's also that balance to strike about not being sucked into something inappropriately. So again, whilst I'm not telling you, Claire, a right or wrong way to respond in that, what I would say to any coach who finds themselves in that sort of situation is to take that pause and think about what needs to happen here. Because I honestly think that we tend in those worrying situations to react rather than to respond. We're too impulsive sometimes. So again, the pause.
And we're too quick, I think, to go into rescuer sometimes. I'm not talking necessarily about this specific example, but often I think we want to go into rescuer.
Yes.
And that removes somebody's agency, and it may be taking away the only bit of power they have left.
Yes. So I think being aware as well of and this is again comes back to personal awareness. What are our habitual patterns? Are we rescuers? Are we perpetrators? Are we victims? What do we tend to do? And using those terms, just kind of referring to the Cartman drama triangle. Yes. We don't stick in any one role. We're in different roles in different relationships. But it's worthwhile, again, standing back, having a think. What's really happening here? And again, that knowing what's happening with your own emotions and how they're driving the situation.
Stand back, pause, notice what's happening in me.
Yes.
They're great questions, aren't they?
Yes. And they fit so many situations, not just this one.
Yeah. So it's interesting, Jenny. I'm always very happy to work with people who are having therapy, psychotherapy, and also want to come for coaching. And one of the reasons for that is I think it's really useful that if anything comes up that needs to be in the other space, you know that they have a pre-existing relationship with somebody and you can just name it and they can take it there.
Yes.
But I guess that, inevitably, although most of the people we work with are going to come in a kind of a spread of a normal range, that sometimes as coaches we will encounter somebody who's outside of that normal curve.
Yes.
So what would we be noticing there?
Well, we've talked a little bit already about sort of anxiety and depression, and certainly that's a spectrum, and it's at its severe end. Anxiety and depression can be really disabling and really affect people's functioning. I guess another area would be if somebody is actually in the process or has already lost touch with reality. And has perhaps developed their own reality. They've perhaps become very suspicious to the point of being paranoid or even deluded about certain things. And, I don't expect that this would happen very often in a coaching context, but I think it's worthwhile being aware when you're in that coaching situation, you're working with somebody one-to-one, you're hearing their side of the story. Without the opportunity really to check it out with other people, that there might be times when you think, hang on a minute, does this really seem a little bit overly suspicious? And I have certainly been in situations where I have got a very long way into conversations with people, even several conversations with people, before I've actually realized that what they're talking about doesn't reflect external reality, and they've lost touch with that. And again, I think that's a difficult area, because often one of the key things about people who with a significant mental health difficulty have lost touch with reality, they don't acknowledge, their reality for them is their reality. The external reality is neither here nor there. So that's probably a rare instance. I'm thinking now, Claire is going to ask me what I would do in that situation. I guess that I would say it's I wouldn't get into sort of arguing the toss with people in that situation. I would just say that it would probably be an indication that coaching is not the right thing at this time. But again, each situation is individual and would require its own attention.
Yes, and I have a little filter in my head actually about data, because I notice that the data that people bring to coaching can be a variety of things. So one is self-reported data, what I say from my perspective, which is often what people do.
Yes.
One is anecdotal data, which is the story I'm hearing around here is, which I may believe to be true. One is the real observational data, what did you see kind of questions. And then Brené Brown, in her latest book, is that called Dare to Lead? She talks about the story I'm telling myself.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yes.
So I like that, because I'm noticing that if you say to somebody, and so the story you're telling yourself is, and I've never had somebody who hasn't had the capacity to go, oh yes,
yes,
that's the story I'm telling myself. And I just wonder whether knowing that there are those different kinds of data and asking a question from a different place might, for example, mean that somebody who actually was psychotic, or whatever your definition of that is, may not be able to engage in that question from a different perspective.
Yes, I think that's very likely. I just want to sort of slightly go off on a tangent, Claire, and just talk about it very briefly, the stories we tell ourselves, because I just think that is such an important thing in terms of mental well-being, mental health. The stories that we cultivate, the stories that we habitually repeat to ourselves throughout our lives, sometimes from childhood, and really how coaching offers an opportunity for some of those stories to be reviewed. I don't mean in a kind of deeply therapeutic way, but just people to sort of challenge the stories that they've always told themselves, because they can be very constricting sometimes.
Yes. And would you like to write a new story?
Yes. And or even, what would the best story, that sort of that there's that opportunity. But just going back to the issue of the sort of losing touch with reality to the extent that it's psychotic, I think that would be a rare thing. But I think that the questions that you clarified there would certainly be good indicators. People's responses to them would be really good indicators. Yeah.
And I mean, personally, I found those questions really useful for me. So the story I'm telling myself is because it just helps it land it in a different place.
Yes. And it also helps, I think, sometimes just in a broader sense, understanding other people in group situations or team situations. What's the story they're telling themselves there? You maybe get a different perspective on somebody who's been really bugging you if you kind of think, well, where are they coming from?
Yes, and the story that they're telling themselves, given what they can see.
Yes. So it occurs to me that this business that we're talking about of standing back, pausing, reflecting, it really, as well as giving you space, it also gives you so much of a better view. I know that's such an obvious thing to say, but it's just kind of just coming home to me more and more.
Yeah. So stand back, pause and reflect. And notice what's going on.
Yes.
But it's a great filter in every conversation, isn't it, to say, what am I noticing?
Yes. And sort of going into what we were saying earlier about the whole transference, counter-transference thing, about sort of what am I noticing and how much of that noticing comes from what I was feeling to start with.
Yes.
Yeah.
Isn't that interesting? Because as you say that, it's like you're kind of, because I know some people have a sort of beginning ritual when I don't personally, but many coaches have a beginning ritual.
Okay.
Which is, what do I need to do as I arrive in the room? But what you're saying there is that in your noticing, go, and how much of that did I bring in with me that I didn't realise?
Yes. And maybe checking in at the start of it and kind of thinking, right, what do I need to leave outside the room?
Yeah.
Because we all have, and certainly that I'm really aware of that in day-to-day psychiatry. What I bring in really could potentially make a difference if I allowed it to.
Yeah.
I know it's an obvious thing to say, but sometimes the obvious, actually, we don't act on the obvious.
No. We notice and then don't do something about it.
Yeah.
So Jenny, thank you so much for everything you've shared with us. Is there anything as we finish that you feel is really important to say to coaches around this boundary with mental health?
Yeah. Well, you're really welcome, Claire. It's lovely to speak to you. I think what I would say is that, just reiterate, it's about awareness, it's about self-awareness, awareness of the person, and I think that's it. I think that's probably, at risk of repeating myself over and over, I think that's what I would say. Thank you.
Notice your stuff.
Yes, notice your stuff.
Thank you to Jenny Forge. So what have been your insights and questions as you've listened to Jenny? And what will you do differently as a result of what you've learnt from this interview? And finally, where will you go to deepen your learning? Do take a moment to think about those things. And now let's listen from a different place. So this time I'm talking with coach and coaching supervisor Anne Archer, who comes at the same subject from a very different place.
So in terms of my work, I'm a coach supervisor, very active in both. And increasingly over the last decade have become very interested in the blend of mental and physical health and how fundamental it is actually for good human functioning. So everything that's, from creativity, decision making, relationships, how we feel, that kind of mind-body connection is fundamental, and I think often missed actually in terms of its importance. So I tend to, if I think about that as the kind of the bedrock of what I do, it ranges from supporting people on a crisis line who are phoning up perhaps with suicidal thoughts or really struggling in some way, right the way through to execs who are, to all extents and purposes, high functioning, thriving adults, big jobs, big capabilities, who just like to check in and check that they're calibrating well for themselves. And then along that continuum, there's mental health awareness. I do a lot of advocacy, mental health awareness for managers, but also for coaches. I train coaches as well in resilience. Sort of faculty there, and I do coach assessing, but I love that sort of real mix of working with coaches, which is my nourishing home, and then working with organisations that are doing their stuff. That's probably it for now, I would think.
I'm sure other things will emerge.
Maybe they will.
And that's nurtured by your grandmotherness.
Yeah, I'm Nanny or Annie chickens because I also keep chickens.
Oh, there you are.
So, I often get Annie chickens. And I just love that kind of real purity of being with little people that just gets you to go, whoa, what really matters here in what you do and who you are and how you are. I think they're a very good leveler.
Yeah.
Actually.
So you've talked quite a lot about leveling and calibrating and checking in. So here we are in the middle of 2021. COVID is coming and going, or we don't know, and we have our fantasies about what is or isn't happening. What are the things that you're noticing around coaching and mental health I think coaches really need to be paying attention to?
Great question for right now, I think, and what's coming for us. So I think we underestimate the power of the levels of stress that have been impacted by a global pandemic. And I think it's very easy to underestimate what's actually what we've had to be able to adjust to and self-regulate against, if you like. So that, as coaches, I have noticed, and I've noticed it through supervision, through my own clients, that more people are showing signs and symptoms of certainly dysregulation, so struggling in some aspect of their life, if you like, because I very much work with the whole person in the whole life, whether it's an exec or somebody specifically wanting to work with resilience. And it's this real challenge of being able to self-regulate because of the pressures and the amount of stress that's in the system. And I just feel that when coaches are able to be with that person openly and with a little antennae that might be able to make a link between a behavior and a potential for not necessarily ill health and a need to have a diagnosis of and medication, but certainly an inability to self-regulate naturally and well. And I really believe in coaches and our ability to be in a room with somebody who perhaps doesn't usually talk about what's going on for them, and they've got somebody there with them wholly and fully, and not judging what they say, so they're able to admit to themselves and to somebody else that maybe things aren't as great as they might be. And I believe if we know as coaches in that moment how to hold that space and not jumping in fear to, oh, well, it's a mental health issue, I need to pass it off, but be with that person as an exquisite listener and an exquisite presence, then we can really support a person in their moment to hear themselves and to acknowledge what's going on. And that can be the first step for somebody to say, right, now I need help. Now I need to go somewhere. And so I think if coaches can be equipped to know more about signs and symptoms and a bit more about perhaps self-regulation and stress management, not because they're necessarily going to be that kind of a coach, but to be able to hold the space with a bit of knowledge to say, okay, how can I hold you? Because I talk to people that are at various different stages of mental health, from being very poorly through to doing actually quite well. I know that what people say over and over and over and over again is that having somebody listen and really listen and not judge and not fix and not advise, but hear and see you in that moment is fundamentally important. And we can do that really well as coaches if we can let go of our own fear and worry about what it might be manifesting.
Yeah. So listen and be and notice and totally avoid diving in.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I'm really interested, those words you were using, dysregulation and self-regulation.
So what I mean by that is self-regulation as a sense of allowing our minds and bodies to work together, our brain and body to work together in the context. So being able to adapt and adjust moment to moment to both what's happening internally and externally. And so it's like allostasis with all our different systems working together. You can think of coherence, and heart rate variability. That's another way of thinking about self-regulation. But it's a way of us being able to healthily access our resources as we need them. Now, for me, when we're dysregulated, one or more of our systems are not functioning as they're designed to, which then means we're likely to perhaps make poor choices, do things that we think are supporting us and helping us to cope with something, but actually they're probably just displacing something for a period of time and it'll come back to us. So somebody who's got a level of anxiety and stress because of a relationship problem, which might be at work, it might be at home, in order to avoid that, they start working really long hours so they don't have to go home. What you're doing then is building up a dysregulation because other systems are going to start failing you because of the way we're designed. So that I don't know if that makes sense to you, but that's how I sort of see it, really.
I think that's a very excellent way of describing balance in a much more inhabited body. Actually, I really like that. So last night we went out.
Oh, wow, exciting times.
And somebody said to me, what have you been doing today? And I said, I've been reading a book on trauma. And he said, why have you been reading a book on trauma? And I said, because the world is traumatized. And he went, really? I thought that was a really interesting response. So what's your response to the word trauma in relation to these days we find ourselves in?
Oh, I notice I sigh because the language that we're using at the moment around mental health, trauma, these sorts of things do trouble me. In a way, for me, trauma is when something is happening too much, too often, too intensely for us to be able to self-regulate. So we're stuck. We're in that place where we're not able to move from it. And there might be trauma that comes from a deeply rooted childhood experience that is in every cell and every fibre of the body. And it's fragmented and it has no rationale and it's difficult to understand. And it could keep coming up and showing up every day. I tend not to use the word trauma relating to today's circumstances for most of us, because it's a bit for me like the word depression. If you're somebody with a clinical diagnosis of depression, there will be days when you will not want to get out of bed because you can't.
Yeah.
If you've had a bad day and you call it depression, we're not really making a separation between what is something that's a normal, natural response to an unusual, abnormal situation, which is that kind of, oh, I'm not self-regulating. Hold on a minute. What do I need to do? Oh, right. Wait, if I take a couple of days out, I'll be okay. Versus a trauma where you absolutely need the support of very careful, perhaps psychological rethinking or body work, but somebody who is trained quite specifically to work with that kind of trauma. So I find it quite hard, and in fact I've been playing around with metaphors. I'm not there yet, so I can't even share one with you, but just this idea of language, because language so impacts then what we do with it. But labeling everybody as traumatized or everybody's got trauma tends to lead us to a place that we're not able to help ourselves.
Yeah.
You know, it's like thinking of mental health as ill health. Well, actually, we do have a lot of capacity to self-heal. We're very strong at survival. And it's like the language that sits with trauma tends to mean something that's more, it's dreadful, we need help, we can't do it ourselves. Whereas actually, I believe that the significant majority of people, I know we've got this sort of place of languishing at the moment, but the significant majority of people in the world have capacity to flip this and to sit up and say, actually, I'm okay. I've got through it. I've got there. But some of the language that we use kind of leads us to think we need somebody else to help us.
And that's the unconditional positive regard, isn't it, of coaching? Or I describe it as a belief that people are robust enough to deal with their own stuff.
Yeah.
Unless it turns out they're really not.
Yes, absolutely. 100% agree with you.
And sometimes they're really not, but actually often they are if they have that listening and engaging space.
Yeah, I like that. That's really nice.
Because otherwise we try and save.
And again, I took some quotes from some people that had attempted to take their life. So quite a few different people. And one of the themes, apart from listening unconditionally, as you say, but I don't want rescuing.
Absolutely.
You know, I don't want you to advise me. You don't know what it's like.
Yeah.
And these are people who are thinking of jumping off a bridge. They are thinking of taking a bottle of pills, or they have done. And now they're in that kind of very difficult place afterwards that they're not sure where they're going to go. And that to me is the same as when we're coaching and we're saying, oh, have you tried this? Or why did...
Or even worse, asking it as a question with the answer in it. Which I think
is actually quite skillful to do.
It is very skillful. But it's the slightly more refined version of have you tried?
Yes.
That means that. Yeah. It's about and there's a vulnerability for us, isn't there? To actually to stay back and let somebody do their own good work. But I loved what Brené Brown said about vulnerability being the first sign of courage. And I think that you know, any time we need to be courageous. And I think now we need to be very courageous.
100%. Yeah. Yeah. And I am finding a really powerful response to my asking people more directly about how you really doing and picking up quite directly with my clients and calling them out on it. It's almost like a relief back at me to say, yeah, I think we ought to talk about that. You know, masks off. Let's just dive in there. And that does take a bit of courage because you're putting yourself out there and they say, this isn't what I paid for. Okay, but it's what I'm feeling it or whatever, you know, having that courage to lean into that, I think. Yeah.
And be deeply human.
Yeah.
With another human being.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think when I'm doing my mental health training and advocacy, that's probably one of the key messages I give, actually, is in those moments of connection, somebody is distressed, be human first. And then the role and responsibility you can hold on your shoulder or on your back. But in that moment, it's that human connection that we kind of lost for a few decades. And I like to hold a bit of optimism that maybe that's coming back.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that bothers me sometimes about, particularly about new coaches actually, is the belief, well, it's a fantasy, isn't it, that makes it look as though the coach needs to be somebody sorted who works with somebody who's not sorted. And actually, we're all human beings. with our own complexities and stuff and everything else. So Anne, earlier on, just before we started recording, you tantalizingly dropped in to the conversation. You said, talk to me about stigma and discrimination.
Yes.
So,
I will. Yes.
Stigma and discrimination.
Yes. And again, this is, I'm going to put this in the coaching realm as well as in the general mental health awareness. And I think we know that there are some quite significant issues for certain populations to talk about mental health where it's just not done. And you know, you can name them or not, but we know this. We know that there's a big drive right now for men to find spaces where they can talk more openly, because sadly, men are more likely to self-medicate than women, and that can be quite a dangerous route to combine sort of alcohol and drugs with a level of stress or dis-ease. And the other thing is, suicide is a sad fact in our world. And if we just pause for a moment and think, it would be the equivalent of 32 planes. I know we're not on planes very often, but 32 planes crashing every year are the number of people that are dying by suicide. And that's not necessarily a true reflection, because coroners have quite a tricky job there to have that as a cause. So,
and that's in the UK,
and that's just the UK.
Wow,
that's just the UK. Okay, so and we don't yet know for sure the impact of the past year on that figure. And it would be wrong of me to say, oh, it's gone up, because that would be just an opinion, not a fact. Now, if I'm feeling, I can't tell you because you'll judge me for it. If I tell you and you're my boss, you might stop me from working on these projects. If I tell you and you're my partner, you might not love me anymore. What that can do is hold all of this tension and angst in. And I think, certainly, I don't know about you, but I know that if I hold stuff in my head, it just goes round in circles. It does a great job of whizzing around.
Yeah.
Now, we also know that if we can be held in a trusting relationship where we can explore what's going on and not feel judged and start to find our own resourcefulness, we're more likely to come out of that dark, difficult place or challenge than if we hold it in.
Yeah.
And at the moment, I think stigma is still very present. So and again, I've noticed when I've done the mental health training and we've talked about suicide, I've had coaches say, I couldn't ask anyone if they're thinking of taking their life. That very question could save that life far more likely. There's no evidence that would suggest that would lead somebody to take their life because you've asked.
Yeah.
Now, language and stigma go together. So by thinking about how we refer to things, what we say, whether we, in our language, are creating the likelihood that somebody will close down or open up, it's a very individual thing, because it's our own words that we use, influenced by media, for example. And then discrimination, it's recognizing, just this is a last year example where somebody that I was working with, it was a group, shared that they'd called an ambulance and the police because a young man was having a psychotic episode. So he was very unwell. He was needing to be in a secure place and taken, to get the right sort of help. But because of the state that he was in, he was really ill and needed restraining or needed help, to get him to safety, if you like. And unfortunately, the mother of this individual explained the circumstances, explained what was going on. And what happened was the response was two white policemen, and this was a person of colour. And the tension just by that act of two police fully clothed with all their police uniform, lights blazing, arriving on the scene, and diving straight in and cuffing the person and putting them in the back of a van, did nothing to improve the sense of unity or trust, or and did a lot to kind of highlight discrimination. Now, it could be ignorance, it could be fear, it could be, oh my goodness, we've got to get this person to safety. And yet there were so many different ways that particular situation could have been handled. So part of the awareness piece is knowing that is real and it happens. And therefore, if you're going in to act in a circumstance, to just have that wider bandwidth to think, right, what might happen here? What might be a different way that I could intervene that could perhaps lead to a better outcome? So I think stigma and discrimination we could all do with just having that little antennae that says, I wonder if what's going to happen next I can predict, and maybe I can do something that would make it better or whatever.
And that's about how we show up as human beings as much as it is about what we do in the coaching room, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And actually both of those influence the other.
I can't remember who it was. It might have even been you that says, who we are is how we coach.
That was Fiona Adamson.
Okay, there you go.
Yeah. And actually we need to work on who we are, don't we? Always. Because otherwise we get back into that loop of looking or feeling or somehow believing that we need to be someone who's sorted working and working with someone who's not.
Yes.
And I think sometimes that's a belief, again, that coaches early on and actually later on in their work, there's a sort of assumption that needs to be true, and it so doesn't.
Recently I was running a group with a bunch of coaches, and I could see there was tension that I wasn't offering. I wasn't saying what had to happen next. And I felt it in my gut, but I thought, no, I know what this is, let it go. And I'm so glad I did, because we're, that's always going to happen, but that willingness to hold the not knowing and to feel that it's okay to say, not sure where this is going, shall we muddle through? It doesn't matter how you say it, really. And it kind of it circles back to the bigger agendas, like, for example, mental health. Is I don't believe we're asking the right questions, because we're jumping in with a question, what do we need to do? Whereas perhaps the question is, what's actually going on? Do we actually even know?
And how do we need to be? What strikes me as I talk to you, Anne, is that you've got this huge breadth of the work that you do, from working with people who are really right on the edge of crisis, right through to people who think they're not, but maybe they are.
Yeah, absolutely. And some are absolutely, oh my goodness. Yeah.
But I'm just curious about how those different spaces that you inhabit impact who you are when you're doing your work. So who you are when, for example, you're working with that group and they want you to come with a fully formed solution.
Well, it's a lovely question. And I would say that right at the core of my answer would be this notion of, how am I self-regulating in this moment? So how am I showing up in as alert and relaxed state as I can for the context, so that I can access my resources? So that might mean, if I'm in a crisis situation, I'm sitting forward, I'm really focused on every word, every gesture, the intensity is there. I'm probably really focused on my training, you know, things that I've learnt. And that would be me being in that alert state so that I can react and respond in that moment. Whereas talking to you here, I'm feeling a sense of alertness for sure, and a slight kind of, when I say tension, like I can feel my muscle tone throughout my torso, which is like a kind of holding myself together. I don't mean that as I'm about to collapse, but more, you know, just that little hyper alert. Like, for example, if you're doing a presentation, you've got that kind of, right, let's just get your words out, be coherent, don't waffle, that sort of thing. In that group you mentioned, there was a different kind of tension, which I felt in my shoulders. So because I'm alert to body and mind, I was sort of able to think, right, let's just tune in to the body state, because that's giving me data that can then influence how I act and what I do. And quite often I don't even notice what's happening because I'm just there. Yeah. You know, but there will be differences. And so, for example, I was with two wonderful guys that are working, they own a business together, and we're doing some team coaching. And I would say that for the majority of the session, we were just in it. And so there was no awareness of what was happening through the conversation. It was happening. So I would say it's always about just being attentive to the combination of mind and body. So noticing if my breathing's changing, what's the signal there, you know, so that sort of noticing. But a lot of the time I don't notice, you know, a lot of the time it's sort of being in there. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, it does. And there's something, isn't there, about embodied wisdom? Because I just notice as you're talking that I guess from every single encounter that you have, whether that's a positive one or a challenging one, that will add a little bit to your wisdom bucket.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, and that's really interesting, because I'd say that's come about, and this is linked, I think, to my grandchildren, because I think there was a moment in time when my first grandchild was born, she's 5 now, where I sort of grew up, I think is the way, and maybe that's the wisdom, where I allowed everything to settle. It was, yeah, it's okay. Now, some people probably reach that place sooner, but that sense of you've got what you need, trust, you know, I love the Bessel van der Kolk, you know, your body knows what's going on. Absolutely, it does. And that level of just trusting that brain and body connection profoundly, I think, is where the embodied wisdom can come in.
Yeah. And as you said that, it felt like you were embodying it in your body and not in your head.
Totally felt it.
And that makes me think, you know, how often do we think wisdom is in the head?
Yes.
And actually what you're describing is wisdom is in the body.
Yes. And I can't remember, it might have been Rumi, and I might be completely wrong on this, but there was something about, or was it Socrates and the questions and the guru? I can't remember who exactly it was, but the idea of wisdom is knowing that you don't know the answer and being okay with that. Yeah. Not that you've got all this wonderful wisdom in your head and all these facts and all this knowledge, but actually it's more wise to know that you don't know everything. Yeah. And I'm really comfortable with that. Yeah. Not everybody is, though, which is quite interesting.
Yeah. So we've gone on quite a journey around mental health and coaching and embodied wisdom and all those things. Thank you so much, Anne. As we finish, is there, if you could share a nugget, what would it be for coaches?
It's something that's come through our conversation about be human first, and that, you know, be the best human you can be first, I think that for me is everything.
Yeah. Be the best human you can be first.
Yeah.
Thank you, Anne. So if people want to get in touch with you, how do they do that?
Well, I have a website, so you can actually make contact there, and there's various different bits of information. It says a bit more about me, and that's at annearcherassociates.com. And then I also have a LinkedIn profile, so you can find me, and it's just Anne Archer is the name that it's under. It's not a company name.
And I'll put that in the programme notes. So
lovely.
Check that out. And thank you to Anne Archer. There's more about making referrals in a useful document that's in the handouts, which you should find in the same place that you found this recording. What have been your insights and questions as you have listened to Anne? And I wonder what you'll do differently as a result of what you've learnt from this interview, and where you'll go to deepen your learning. Just take a moment to think about that. We've spent some time thinking about mental health so far in this collection of conversations. Let's dig deeper now into the realms of power and unconscious bias with Coach Smita Tharoor, who spoke to me from lockdown Delhi. For me, unconscious bias matters because it begins to open up the conversation about power. And the ICF talk about the coach being aware of and actively managing any power or status difference between the client and me that may be caused by cultural, relational, psychological or contextual issues. What a great statement that connects the psychological that we've been talking about with the cultural that we're going to listen now to Smita talking about. So let's hear what she has to say. I love that quote from R.D. Laing, who says, well, it's not apparently, it's from Daniel Goleman, who wrote it in the style of R.D. Laing. And it says, the range of what we think and do is limited by what we fail to notice. And because we fail to notice that we fail to notice, there is little we can do to change until we notice how failing to notice shapes our thoughts and deeds.
It's beautiful, isn't it? I love it. And I like Daniel Kahneman in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow,
yes,
where he's essentially saying this, but in many more pages and many more examples. And, he just talks of how when we jump to a conclusion, that's what I call unconscious bias. And he talks about thinking fast or thinking slow. It's actually our brains. And we've got the fast brain, we've got the slow brain. So, and we need both. Both are very important to our lives. But sometimes the fast brain jumps in and allows us to make a decision without us realizing that maybe that decision that we've made, whether we're in a coaching context or any other, may not be the right decision. So the quote is actually is a great opener for this conversation on the unconscious bias.
So what are the things that we need to be paying attention to, Smita?
It's not things as much as listening. And whenever I say listening, what I'm talking about, and I don't know why, I always visualize Dumbo the elephant's ears, not to make us fly, but to actually listen as much as you can without allowing your own thoughts to come in the way when you're listening. Because unconscious bias essentially is you're talking to me and I am not really listening to what you're saying. I'm listening to how I can respond to you. Because of my own narrative, my own experiences, my own story that I want to share with you as well. So don't listen the way you're saying your story. And that's one. It's about how we listen when we're having conversations. And the second is reflection. So that when we're going away and we've had this conversation with somebody, you can reflect back on it and wonder whether you did really listen with what I call the Dumbo ears, or did you actually bring in your own story when you were talking to the other individual?
So whose lens are we listening through?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. We're trying to listen from their lens and not from our lens.
Yeah.
Because not that they won't have their own unconscious biases, of course they will. Every one of us do, including you and I, but that's not the point. if we're talking about unconscious bias and coaching, which is the context of this conversation, then it is very much about, I'm the coach, I'm coaching you, you're talking to me about X, Y, or Z. I need to be aware that I have unconscious biases. Therefore, when you are saying something, I might jump to a conclusion about something else and not listen the way I should be listening as a coach. Let me just try and think of an example to make it more contextual. I've actually been, as you know, doing a series of interviews for my podcast on the unconscious biases. So let me share a story that somebody shared with me, where he is a working class, these are his words, not mine, working class Irish man. And he runs a project on racism in Ireland, Sports and Racism, SARI, Sports and Racism Ireland. He talks about the fact that he was working with some young children from a fee-paying school. And because they were from a fee-paying school, his unconscious bias kicked in. His job, sorry, I should repeat what I'm saying. The purpose of him working with these young people was he was doing something around the United Nations model, and he was doing some work with them around racism. These young people happened to be from a private school. Therefore, his own unconscious bias jumped to all kinds of conclusions about how they would be reacting and thinking and approaching what he was talking about. Whereas his job was to actually listen to them and get the best out of them for the project that he was doing. The reason he had that unconscious bias was because he sees himself as a working class bloke in Ireland, and he felt that those young people who went to a fee-paying private school would have privileges that he never had. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I'm thinking as you're talking about that, I've been watching the Mallory Blackman Noughts and Crosses drama on BBC One. We're watching it on iPlayer. And that's really interesting on kind of prejudice and unconscious bias, because
I want to watch that, except being in lockdown Delhi, I don't have access to BBC iPlayer.
Indeed.
So I am looking forward to coming back, who knows when,
it's
so
just
I can
really,
catch up.
It's really interesting because it enables you to notice so much that you fail to notice.
For example?
Well, I lived in a village in Africa in my early 20s for 2.5 years and was the minority. So I've inhabited the role of the minority and experienced a small part of what that feels like. A very small part. And it was just interesting to be watching this thing where that's kind of the volume on that is turned up significantly. And it's just it's very challenging and useful, and yeah, it's useful.
No, it makes sense. I mean, having not seen it, but I can imagine what you're saying, and I'm always thinking about those kind of stories. I remember I was speaking at a conference in the United Kingdom, and a young white English woman came to me with large concerns about how she was going to bring up her son, because she's a practicing Muslim, because she's married to a Muslim and she would like to bring her son up as a Muslim. But when she was talking to me, it was very clear that she was worried about how her society, the society she lives in, would approach her son in school. That was her main worry. And so she said, how do I protect my son and yet bring him up to be a practicing Muslim? It's a very difficult one. But there were so many things at play here. At one level, her own belief system and what she wants to do, and at the other, having lived a different life where she was not a practicing Muslim, and the kind of things that she's reading about in society, in the papers, in the press, on television, about Muslims, she has her own unconscious bias. So it was a strange contradiction that she was having within herself, that she was fighting with. I really felt for her.
So an unconscious
it's
bias.
Not easy.
No.
Sorry, go ahead.
An unconscious bias about her own stuff.
Yes.
Mm.
Yeah. So it's very nuanced. So what is unconscious bias? It's very, very nuanced. I always visualize an onion that never finishes peeling. You take one layer off and then you've got another layer and then you've got another layer. And because life keeps changing, right? So this young lady, if we continue her story, from 0 to, I don't know, making up an age, she looked, give or take, in her early 30s. So let's say 0 to 25, she lived not in practicing the Islamic religion. And she chose to, whatever she chose to do in that life. And then she met and married who she did and lives a very different life. And all of these things will impact us. But what kind of stories had she experienced from 0 to 25 will continue to impact how she's thinking from 25 to whatever age she is today.
Yeah.
So, but are we reflecting? That's why I'm saying listening and reflecting, these two big ones, are we reflecting enough? Are we looking back and recognizing that we are constantly changing as human beings? So what I thought, especially now, especially in lockdown land all over the world, we've got the opportunity to stop and to think and to reflect, to genuinely do it. Can't say, God, I've got back-to-back meetings, I'm chasing mail, I've got stuck on the tube. You don't have any excuse anymore. And how much do we reflect? How much do we look back on 6 months from now, on the conversation we had yesterday on the phone, whatever it might be, and learn from it for our own growth and development? I don't know. It just sounds maybe a bit idealistic, but I think very important.
Yeah, and owning our intersections.
Yeah, that seems to be a very popular word these days, intersectionality.
Yeah.
What do you understand by it?
That we belong to lots of different groups. That's what I understand by it. And that everybody, and some of those are visible and some of those are invisible.
Yeah, exactly. But it's just interesting how language changes, because this word intersectionality, I don't remember using it, certainly not even 3 years ago.
No.
As often, just naturally, like you said it naturally. You didn't even think about it. And it's suddenly become a very often used word. And I think that's a lot about the world at large, different parts of the world, whether we're talking India or London or United States or any other country that you want to throw in the mix. We're all looking at ourselves, at our countries, whichever country we are at, seeing how we are as human beings and reflecting it at a larger level and recognizing that maybe the way we behaved 20, 30, 40 years ago was not the right way to behave. Whether it was the Weinstein kind of example or whether it was something else, because the kind of stories that we have heard about somebody seeing someone as a one-dimensional human being and then showing extreme bias is no longer seen as the right thing to do in so many regards. And that's a brilliant thing. And that's why we talk about intersectionality, because here you are, a white English woman, visually to look at, but yet you know, but most other people wouldn't know, that you know what it feels like to be in the minority, to live in a country amongst Black people where you stood out and people looked at you differently, and you know what that feels like.
Yeah.
But why would anybody know that? They would look at you and they'd assume, see, white English woman, what would she know about me if I'm talking about somebody who's not white? So that's really interesting. Sorry, did I digress? I think I went down a different path.
No, it's just I think it's fascinating, and we all have these. Well, we have hidden loyalties, don't we? And we have
so
loyalties.
Where do they come from? Loyalties. I like what you said. So hidden loyalties. So where do you think our hidden loyalties come from?
Can I go on a tangent?
Yes, please.
You talked a bit earlier about how we might feel or behave now is different from how we may have felt or behaved in the past.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wonder whether that also brings us, as well as hidden loyalties, it brings hidden shame. That there will have been seasons in our lives when we will have behaved in certain ways towards certain groups of people, which came from the person we were then and the things that we did or didn't know at that point, which in our present we regret, but we did our best.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that's about what I would add to that is that in the present, what I would say, and I say to myself and to anyone else who's listening, we reflect on it. We regret that we may have chosen to behave like so, but don't berate ourselves about it.
Exactly.
Because that will then destroy us as human beings.
Yeah.
Accept it, look it face on, regret it, learn from it, and then move on. That's really important.
Yeah. Which is almost notice it and name it and move on.
Name it. Exactly. Name it. Name it to yourself, even if you don't have the courage to name it to anyone else. You can just say it loud in an empty room.
Yeah.
Just you, yourself, and you. Yeah, absolutely.
So what?
Oh, this whole... Yeah, go ahead.
I was just wondering what we were saying when I took us off on a tangent.
Loyalty. You said hidden loyalties, which is not really tangential, actually, because whether it's hidden regrets or hidden loyalties will be there too, and I understand that. But I was wondering whether you could... I'm happily interviewing you now, but not. Perhaps you could share a story about what you mean by hidden loyalties.
Well, if you go back to my experience in Kenya, those friends that I made then stand with me in some encounters that I have and are hidden loyalties.
Right. Yeah. So it comes down really to memories, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's or for want of a better word, our narrative, our life story. And our life story changes all the time. Who would have known that I would be in Delhi for 2 months or maybe 3, who knows, when I arrived in the country for 3 weeks. And then those 3 months that I will experience before I come back to London will also influence all kinds of things, including both positive and not so positive memories of the looking back 1 year from now. I look back to my few months in Delhi, and that would have impacted and influenced how I behave 1 year from now. I'm certain of it. I don't know what that will be, and I don't know how it'll look, but it will influence me in some way.
Yes, and you spoke before we started recording this very deeply about the stories of some of the people that you've heard of in India returning to their family homes because of coronavirus.
And it's exactly, and the haves and the have-nots, and the acknowledgement of the fact that I am privileged, and I don't know what to do about it other than articulate it for the moment. But I'm lucky. I have a home, I have food, I have electricity, I have internet. You can interview me sitting in the United Kingdom, and I'm in Delhi, and there are people dying because they can't get home.
Yeah,
and they're walking. It's just sad. Yeah. Anyway, it's about reflection. It's about values. When we're talking about unconscious bias, it is also about our values. And I think when we reflect, and I say the kind of things I've just said, or you think something else about hidden loyalties and all of that, it boils down to our values. What's important to us? And I don't think we have the right to suggest to anyone in any kind of coaching or otherwise that your values are not the right values, because they're yours and they're your story and they're your narrative. I may or may not agree with it, but that's not the point. So I think that's really important to recognize in a coaching or understanding of unconscious bias.
Yes, and some of us are very clear on our values, aren't we? And then sometimes we have values that we only fall over and notice them when they're challenged. And you think, oh, I didn't know that was something that was so important to me, but now it's been challenged. My goodness, that's a value.
In fact, it reminded me of something that I do in one of my workshops, because I as you know, I also deliver training. And one of my workshops, what I do, depending on the length of time I've got, is I give a list of values. I think there are about 40 in list, I can't remember now, about 40. And it's things like, I want to have friends, I want to be wealthy, I want to have integrity, I want to be good at physically fit. I'm just trying to think of some more off the top of my head. Well, things like that, all kinds of different 40. And then what I do is, and I've got to say a group of 15 or 20 people, and I give them a piece of paper and ask them to look at the 40 and ask them to choose the top 8 that really matter to them. So they tick, and I say, read them all, and I give them time to do this. And then they tick the top 8. And then I give them a piece of paper, ask them to tear it into 4 pieces. And I say, from that top 8, take top 4 and put them into 4 pieces of paper, which they do. And then what I do, which is what you were just saying, is that I then go around with literally with a dustbin in my hand and ask them to scrunch one up and throw it in the bin. And you should see some of the people, I don't want to throw this away, please don't let me do it. You've got to do it. You've got to throw it. This is the game we're playing. You've got to throw it in the bin. And some of them are like literally, holding it to their hearts, saying, I will not give you this. It's too important. I don't want to throw it in the bin. But they do, because I force them to do, because that's the game we play. And at the end of it, they all have one key value amongst that list. I'm not suggesting it's a definitive list, of course not. But there's one thing on that list that is really, really the number one for them. And then I get them to all read it out aloud. I promise you, I have never, with a group of 20 people, I've never had more than maybe 3 people who've had the same value.
Wow.
So what does that then say? What does that then say about how we communicate with each other? So I think that my top value is making friends. You think that your top value is being rich, and that so-and-so in our table's top value is having high integrity. And they are looking at you think, what kind of person is she? And we're having our own value system, judging the way we are having an opinion on somebody else. Now, is that a joke or what? An ironic joke?
I'm so been thinking for quite a lot of our conversation, Smita, about Argyris's ladder of inference, about how we move from real data to making assumptions and beliefs and conclusions so quickly. And often when I'm teaching coaches, we do a huge amount of work on, as much as we are possibly able, work in the realm of real observable data, because there's a lot of fantasy up that ladder. That I make assumptions about somebody else and all those kind of things.
Yeah. So
how interesting that in a room of 20, you barely get 3 with the same.
Yeah. And then Pat, it's so interesting because you see their faces and then they suddenly realize that, so everyone, religion is another one that a lot of, many people find is the number one value for them. So, each of us have their own thing that you don't realize it until you're forced to choose.
Yeah.
We don't think about it. We just live it. Yeah. That's what you were saying earlier on, which is why I just went there. I was immediately visualizing a training room and on the people in there when you said that, because we just live it.
Yeah. So one of the in the ICF ethical thing, one of the things it says is that the coach is sensitive to the client's identity, environment, experiences, values, and beliefs. And I want to kind of put in brackets, even if they don't know what they are and you can't see them.
Exactly. Because you can't see them, and it might be just a turn of phrase or a sentence or one word they choose to say while they're being coached that pings in your head, that may not sit with your values or may allow your unconscious bias to suddenly jump in. And it's really, that's why I keep saying listen with Dumbo ears. You really listen. Otherwise, easier said than done, as you know very well, because you're an outsider, so I know that. But I mean, we've got to keep saying it like a mantra to ourselves, that when we are talking to somebody, really listen. But not so easy sometimes.
So you've talked
especially
about...
with family, I was thinking.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, I'm learning to live with my mother again, who I love dearly. But I have not lived with her for 3 months at a stretch for a very long time. So I'm learning.
Yeah, that raises all sorts of other things, doesn't it? About who do we become in a relationship?
Yeah.
And that's also true about who do we become in a relationship when we're coaching somebody. Because I imagine that between you and your mum, there's some daughter-mother thing going on.
Yeah, we're very different characters.
Yeah.
So it is really about my respecting the fact that she is very different to me and accepting her belief system and her values, rather than her trying to make a change to my belief system or my values, which of course is easier said than done when you're with people you love.
Under pressure.
Yeah.
So,
that song, what is that? Yeah, go ahead.
We came into this conversation and you talked about the value of Dumbo ears and the value of reflecting after conversations about what did we fail to notice effectively. I'm just wondering, in terms of live in the room in a conversation, what are the things that you're learning that we can pay attention to actually in the room that enables us to notice what we fail to notice?
I'm thinking aloud. Again, it depends whether it's a coaching situation with one person or whether we're having a group supervision or group coach with more than one person will make a big difference in what we're noticing in the room. Just expressions of people, movement, how people sit, how people, just the general feel. I don't know how to explain it. You will do better than me to explain it. But you can feel something in the air when you're talking to somebody. I don't know if I'm making any sense when I'm saying that. But it's something about the environment that makes the individual that you're speaking to more relaxed, more comfortable, just by how they're sitting, how they're looking, their expressions, how they're communicating, all of that will tell you, even if they haven't opened their mouth yet, or they're keeping quiet and listening to you. They don't have to talk for you to understand that they're going through X, Y, or Z. I don't know. Am I making sense?
Yeah, and one of the principles that I like to use in coaching is notice, don't diagnose. So what you're describing there is notice what you see or hear or sense.
Yeah. Feel it. And that's why I'm saying you can actually feel it in the air. It sounds really ridiculous. But you can, if you really concentrate and you're really listening with Dumbo ears, you can feel that there is a change in the way the individual is speaking to you. And if that is the case, then you've got to listen even harder, what I say, because we don't know why there is a change, obviously.
And notice it in relation to them.
Yes, exactly. That's the point.
It's the spectrum of what you notice that they're on, rather than comparing them to others or projecting or whatever.
Then of course we've come in with our own stories, haven't we? Oh, why is she looking like that? That reminds me, when I spoke to so-and-so yesterday, they were looking like, no, we've got, that's the end of that session. But it's very easy for us to advise. I'm telling myself that because I know that the reality is not that easy. I know that we're at the end of the day only human beings, and whatever, we'll just jump in. Can't help it.
And Dumbo ears takes a lot of energy, doesn't it?
It takes an enormous amount of energy. I don't know how you manage to I don't know how many clients you coach in one day, but you're probably like a wet rag at the end of it, because I'm sure you use your Dumbo ears. I know how you coach. So it's, you kind of sitting there, collapse in a heap, because you have listened and tried very, very, very hard only to listen to them and not bring anything else of yours into it. But as with anything, whether you're baking a cake or whether you're coaching, the more you do it, the more that the idea of double years and reflection and so on will become easier. Early on, it's going to be hard bloody work, let's put it mildly.
Yeah, and I think I liken it to Teflon, Smitha.
Right.
In that there's something about giving somebody your full attention and really noticing and really listening and not taking it in.
That's a very good point.
So I think that if
yes.
you do the Dumbo ears and you internalize everything that you hear or see, you'll be like a wet rag very quickly.
Yes.
What I do, if you want my top tip, is that I give them my absolutely full unconditional attention. I call it being attentively not bothered. So I will give them my full attention and I will notice what I notice, but I don't take it in. So one of the things that I notice is I can't remember after coaching sessions what the detail of what they said.
Yeah, but that's a skill that has to be learned, Claire. It doesn't come easily.
It doesn't come easily, and it actually means that the data and the work resides where it resides, and we only notice the things that are most useful to notice. And of course, that's never perfect, and we always miss things because we are human, and that's how it is, and that's okay.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Keep the Dumbo ears, but don't internalize. Listen, focus, and but don't internalize. Which actually, looking back on my coaching sessions, is actually what I do instinctively. I didn't quite realize it the way you've said it, though. But I'm going to add the Teflon to my Dumbo ears wherever I go. Because that's very, very important. Yeah. Because it can be very draining otherwise. Some days I get Teflon and some days I don't. But
and it's not for us to take the stuff home.
Of course it isn't. We're trying to help them. What's the point of taking it home? Then we can't help them the next time we meet them.
No, so if we take it in, then we will take it home.
Exactly right. So true.
Wow. Well, thank you, Smitha. Is there anything else that you'd like to share this morning?
This afternoon.
That was a piece of unconscious bias.
Not at all. No, in fact, I'm about to be starting a webinar on the unconscious bias. So that's the new world order these days, as you know.
Indeed.
Which is great. And I'm looking forward to that. It'll be interesting to see how we do that. No, I think really, for me personally, unconscious bias is such a powerful yet such a simple topic, which is why I'm doing this podcast series on it. If more people could become aware of the power of our own narrative, our own life story, call it what you like if you don't want to call it unconscious bias, and how our life story influences us without us realizing it, we would make our lives so much easier. Yeah. So on a very selfish level, it's important for us to understand this, because we will be happier people in our relationships and anything we do. That's, I find, the power of this, of these two little simple words.
Yeah.
But no, I've enjoyed very much talking to you.
And you. And that's interesting because you've taken us right back to R.D. Laing, because we fail to notice that we fail to notice there's little we can do to change until we notice how failing to notice shapes our thoughts and deeds.
Well said, exactly.
Thank you.
R.D. Laing, or is it Daniel Kahneman?
Whoever it is. So,
thank you so much.
How do people contact you or listen to your podcast, Smitha?
Well, my company is Tharoor Associates, so it's the same as my surname. For those of you who can't spell it, if you know my name, it's Tharoor Associates. And my company essentially offers advice on the unconscious bias, including training and coaching and so on. Podcast has not been launched yet. Watch the space. When I do, I will shout out from the rooftops, and hopefully, Claire, you will tell all your friends and colleagues too.
I will.
I will also put it on Twitter. My Twitter hashtag is Smita.Tharoor. So I put it everywhere I can. But my website is there, and that would be a best place to start, I guess.
Brilliant. Thank you, Smita. And her podcast is indeed up and running, and it's called Between Us, Stories of Unconscious Bias, and it's available on all the major podcast platforms. So what have been your thoughts as you've listened to Smita and your questions? What will you do differently as a result of what you've learned from this interview? And where are you going to go to deepen your learning? Just take a moment to think about that. So we've talked about power, we've talked about psychological power, we've talked about mental health. And now we're going to talk about confidentiality, because if our boundary around confidentiality is that everything is confidential unless there's a risk of harm to self, harm to others, or harm by others, what do we need to think about in advance about, for example, what we're going to do if a safeguarding disclosure happens in coaching? Here's Nikki Brownjohn, a safeguarding professional who's also trained as a coach. Part of my learning in the last few weeks is that actually, in relation to safeguarding, we absolutely need to know what we're going to do before anything happens. So I was in a conversation listening to a coach coaching on a recording, and there was a disclosure, and there was then a conversation about that he and I had, the coach and I had, about what's confidential and what isn't. And I realised at that moment that we just don't talk about safeguarding. And we need to. It's really, really important. So today I'm joined by Nikki Brownjohn, who knows a lot about safeguarding and about coaching. Welcome, Nikki.
Thank you. Yes. So my background, I'm Nikki Brownjohn, and I have spent a long time working within safeguarding and for within the health service, and then about 5 or 6 years ago became a coach as well. So it was sort of really interesting to sort of do that difference. I'm sort of used to doing a lot of safeguarding supervision with people who are with professionals who are really working really closely with families experiencing safeguarding issues, and then the coaching is sort of very separate to that. And so I was really sort of interested to sort of think about what happens when there is that disclosure around safeguarding in this different environment.
Indeed. So Nikki, I'm just curious, why do you think we don't talk about it?
I think there's a fear, I think, around what to do if there is if something happens. People would rather sort of it's easier to walk away and not think about it. I sort of think back to my very early days in safeguarding, and I remember walking into a hospital and hearing some shouting going on. And it was an adult shouting at a child, and I couldn't see what was going on. And another member of staff from the hospital came out, and they could see, and they just said to me, "Just don't go there." And it's always stuck with me. It's decades ago, but it's always stuck with me. Is that actually there might not have been anything going on. It might have just been a parent trying to get a child away from a car coming towards them, but it might have been an issue. And so we have a responsibility just as citizens to act if we see something in a supermarket. We have to, the worst thing you can do with a safeguarding issue is to do nothing. So it's not having to do anything major, but it's the worst thing is to just do nothing, because you just never know.
I'm really curious about that statement that you just said, Nikki, just don't go there. Because one of the things that I wonder about is whether coaches hide behind confidentiality.
Yeah.
And we say, well, it's confidential. So they told me that in a confidential space, so I'm not going to do anything. And it's interesting, my sense as a supervisor listening to that recording, because I had a conversation with some people I was staying with the previous week where they were talking about safeguarding, and And I heard in that recording that the person who was being coached was safe. They were not going to do any harm to anyone else. But the risk that was in my head was that actually there was a risk of harm to others by somebody else. And my sense was I had never thought about the next layer out being an important thing in coaching, but having thought about safeguarding a bit as a volunteer, I'm safeguarding trained now as a volunteer in something I do outside coaching. And I noticed that we don't do safeguarding training for coaches, which is an interesting thing, isn't it?
Yes, no, so I was thinking about sort of, would I advise everybody to go and get safeguarding trained? Well, I think I think it's good. It's always good to have some knowledge, but it doesn't have to be anything major. And I think it is more around having that awareness. And I think going back to the issue around confidentiality. And certainly I know when I did my coaching training, I think because I sort of went into it sort of from my background of that confidentiality, yes, but there's only to a certain extent. Yeah. If there is somebody, if there's something going on that just cannot, and it should. No, I don't think. No, in my experience, I haven't had to. I would think it would be it wouldn't be a frequent occurrence, but it's being able to be sure what, as a coach, I would do if something came out in that session that I wasn't expecting, and that actually it's not about the person who's with me, it's beyond them, and that something could happen to somebody else, and so therefore having it in my toolbox, I suppose, to what would I do in that circumstance. And so I think it is very important for all coaches just to be aware that, yes, we don't go and tell everybody that Joe Brown, I just coached Joe Brown and they've just said this.
Absolutely.
But actually, it's the same principle, I think, as if your client is sort of indicating that actually that they're in tears and they've just and there's mental health issues or anything like that is beyond the coaching relationship. Yeah. So if it's beyond the coaching relationship, then actually what, as a coach, what is my responsibility to follow that through?
Absolutely. So I'm sensing as you're talking, Nikki, that there's a number of different kind of phases about this. So I'm sensing there's a, what do I need to think about now generally? Yeah. And then there's probably also, what do I do when it happens? And then, and how do I set up confidentiality with my client when I start working with them? And then I've also got a question that says, if we're only having 2 sessions on time management, and that's very different from if you're working with somebody monthly, say over the course of a year, how do you make sure that the confidentiality agreement is safe enough and is safeguarding aware without it becoming something absolutely enormous, and yet it needs to be present?
So I think if I can just go back to sort of preparing.
Yeah, should we start there?
Yeah. So I think, so just as a coach, sort of just before having any setting up any relationship with a client, it's just having that being safeguarding aware, knowing how one's feeling in themselves. So if it's a coach who's maybe had a traumatic experience, just come out of a domestic abuse relationship, or anything of that sort, that's something that has maybe sort of worn them down personally, but they feel able to act as a coach because they sort of feel like they're doing about time management, and it's nice and easy to sort of focus on.
Yeah.
But just being aware that what if something was said to you that weren't prepared for? Am I ready to hear I said bad news, and will my reaction to it be objective, as if I, and it's about using the coaching skills really. So will I be able to utilize my coaching skills, properly if there was some bad news that actually, so take an example of domestic abuse. If it's a coach who's just maybe sort of a couple of years ago been through a domestic abuse situation themselves, and so thinking about, well, if a client disclosed that they were subject to domestic abuse, how would I feel about that, and what would my response be?
That's interesting, isn't it, Nikki? Because actually that's absolutely, and that makes me think about bigger issues, which is, how do we manage ourselves when somebody brings our story, as it were, something that's in our story is their story? And that could be about all sorts of things. That could be about divorce. It could be about bankruptcy. It also could be about really happy things.
Yeah.
And as much as we're listening to them saying what they're saying, it will also trigger in us memories of whatever our thing was, which makes it quite an art to be able to be fully present and listen to them whilst acknowledging our stuff and laying it slightly to the side in service of the person that we're talking to. Interesting.
And I think, just to add to that, I think within my safeguarding role, I know you always have to have safeguarding supervision if you're working closely within safeguarding work. But I know I've had experience where previously I'd been able to deal with a story and just deal with it objectively and just move on with it, and then something will happen and it'll trigger some strange memory. and it is that actually then when you have supervision on it, actually I wasn't looking at that in the way that I would have, because of what experience I've had. So it's you just never know, you don't know what will impact. So it's just, I think, really having that, being conscious of that actually how will I use my coaching skills to sort of absolutely be present.
That's such a great question, isn't it, to think about in supervision, whatever the trigger is.
Yeah,
because it could be anything.
Yes. Yeah.
And actually it's also the same if they say, oh, I spent a long time living in France. And if you lived in France, that will also bring that back. So it's not only about negative things. So how do we deal with triggers is a fabulous supervision question. Thank you. So what else do we need to know or think about in advance now, really?
So having some awareness, a sort of thought about what action would need to be taken. So if someone was to disclose a safeguarding issue, for the coach to be able, not to, you don't have to have all the training and know everybody to contact, but just to know, okay, so if this happened, I might need to stop the session, or I might need to just contact someone, or just have a think about where we could go with this. Yeah. So it's useful to just be aware of, say, for example, just knowing that, oh, actually there's the NSPCC would always be a good starting point, or if wherever I'm working, it might be that actually if if I'm working in Surrey in England, then actually, well, at least I know that there's Surrey Police and there's Surrey Social Services. There's always somewhere that you could go for advice.
Absolutely, and it's interesting because I've thought quite a lot about it, because there have been other safeguarding things that have emerged. I've been coaching a long time, and I've had other safeguarding things that emerge on training courses that I've run, and I'm very confident when I'm working in an organisation, for example, a public sector or a not-for-profit organisation, they all have safeguarding policies. And so in those contexts, I'm super confident that I'll just say, so now we need to think about, I need to talk to the safeguarding advisor in your organisation, because I know that's where I'll get good advice.
Yeah.
But as you say, the question is, what do I do if I'm an independent coach and I'm not working with this individual in the context of their organisation? So you mentioned there the NSPCC, and if you're in the UK, they have a hotline which is able to advise, and they're fabulous. And the number is 0808 800 5000. So anyone who's listening to this podcast from other parts of the world, if you know the national safeguarding number for your country, do let us know what that is, and we'll pop it in at the end of the podcast. So thank you, Nikki. So what else do we need to know or think about in advance?
I think then really sort of moving into sort of how the contracting will go, and around sort of who, I suppose, sort of just who the person is, where you're meeting. Is there anything that you've heard in any conversations with them before the session that might indicate that there might be some other information coming through outside of what you're going to be coaching?
So that's all in the contracting.
Yeah.
So what do you recommend that we say?
So
or include?
I think it's really going back to the confidentiality. I think around sort of in that contracting, it's about being clear about what the purpose is of coaching, and what they're there for. But then in the confidentiality section, just being clear that if there was something outside of what they wanted to talk about, which would give some concern about the safety of either themselves or others, then we would have to stop and have a recontract and talk about what action that we are going to take within our relationship, I think. And I think I sort of generally, would use that. I always, whether I've sort of been working within an organisation or working with a client sort of outside, that actually and maybe sort of it might be sort of quite flippant in a way that it's said, but it's sort of just adding that no, I can't, no, I should be able to offer full confidentiality, but there might be something, but I would always check with the client before doing anything with that information, so that because I think it's so that they can continue to own it.
Yeah.
So that makes sense.
So something about it's confidential unless these kind of things happen, and if that happens, then we'll talk about it.
Yes. Yeah.
Fabulous. And would you have a light version if you were doing 2 sessions on time management, or would you go for the full hog?
I think it's always just worth having that as the addendum to the to talking about confidentiality, because I think I know situations I've been in, think, oh yes, this would be fine, and then someone drops a bombshell, and it's not necessarily around safeguarding, but I thought we were going to really just talk through this, and actually no, they once they realise, I think it is that thing around once they've got hold of a coach, I think it's really important to realise that a lot of people might not have had the opportunity to sit and have someone listen to them and give them attention.
Absolutely.
So for all that we think, yes, we're not counsellors, we're not doing this, it's, you know, and we might, you know, and we would have told the client this. It's really interesting, I think, sort of when you get down to it, that they've got that person actually giving them some time and space, and so that lighting up, making the client aware of what's going on, will produce, you know, some things that they might not have realised was an issue. So you do just never know.
Absolutely. And actually, one of the things that that we do is we have a footer when we confirm the coaching agreement, as it were, and it just says, looking forward to being your coach, and then it says terms and conditions in the footer. And we've got them in quite a lot of detail, which means that although we are going to talk about it in the conversation, they have already read and acknowledged that they've read the kind of the full version, which means that you can manage it, you can turn it up or turn it down a little bit because they've already read the deal. About it's confidential except when it isn't.
Yes.
And this is what it isn't might look like.
I think I would say, sort of with my safeguarding hat on, I think that is just really, really a solid way of taking things forward, because otherwise you do. I think as a coach, it would be so easy just to drop ourselves in it if we haven't mentioned the extent of the confidentiality, because you know, an individual might sort of think, oh yeah, it's okay because I've just said, you know, it's all confidential, so I can just let this out, because I can just talk to them about it and I haven't got to then do anything about it, you know, and I can still keep it hidden.
Yes.
You know, and you know, so it becomes another hurdle for that person to jump if they hadn't realised that actually, if I start talking about it now, I've got, and I'll have help to take things forward. But actually, I've got to actually think. I've got to be ready to do something now.
Oh yeah, it's interesting. I was watching the BBC television show Silent Witness the other day, and an old one, and the hero was talking to a child, and the child said, if I tell you a secret, will you keep it secret? And she said, that depends what it is. Which I thought was brilliantly held, because she in that few words, she was giving the whole policy in a light enough way that it wasn't terrifying. We train coaches, and we have a safeguarding page in our handouts, and it's difficult, isn't it? Because part of me would want to say at the beginning, when we talk about confidentiality, that we also need to talk about safeguarding. But again, if you go through it in huge detail, that scares the living daylights out of people who think they've only come to learn about having a slightly better conversation at work, and yet it still needs to be spoken of. So again, I just lightly refer to it and say it's all in the handouts, and I invite you to read it there. And if and when we need to do anything about it, either we stay within the safeguarding policy of your organisation, if this is an internal course, and if this is an external course, an open programme, then I'm the safeguarding advisor and you come and talk to me. And that seems to cover it off nicely. But it's, you know, it's really important. And I've been on a number of different courses as a delegate where it just hasn't been spoken of, and where huge disclosures have been made. So it matters. It really, really matters.
And I think there has been a difference, certainly, you know, in this country, sort of within the safeguarding arena, sort of within public services, for example, and with voluntary services, you know, over the last sort of 15, 20 years, sort of from starting off in safeguarding, and you do some training, and if you're asked at the beginning who's had experience of this anywhere, and no one would put their hand up. And then sort of in the last 10 years, it's been everyone's put their hand up, because within the local community, sort of, you have neighbours. I sort of like to think about the supermarket sort of situation. That we're not, so that just people aren't going into the supermarket. Then they're not walking past and ignoring if they're witnessing visible abuse going on. They might feel unable to deal with it themselves, but they could go along to the staff in the shop, and actually the staff in the supermarket would have more of a responsibility because it's on their premises, that they have that duty of care. But so it is, and I don't think it is something to be afraid of, because it's not asking people to go out and do everything. It's just knowing that actually there are services around, there's contacts around that I could ask for advice if I needed to. I haven't got to sort of just take over and deal with the situation myself.
But isn't it interesting, because as you're talking, I'm thinking the emergence of safeguarding is a very important thing. I wonder whether it came from working in service of the service users, so the people who use the public sector, the people who use the voluntary organisations, and now that's in place, it means that there's a way to manage it if you're talking to a colleague and a safeguarding issue emerges.
Yeah.
So in corporates, I wonder what they do.
Yes, yeah. But you can see it in reviews, and that actually sometimes, and I sort of keep using domestic abuse as an example, but I think it is a good example to use, that if you're working with somebody in a colleague, there will be some colleague somewhere, and that's at any level, who probably is either experiencing domestic abuse as a victim or as the perpetrator. Yeah. And so for organisations, that that they do all need to have some sort of very simple policy of actually, if this was disclosed, what would we do about it? Yeah. And how do we how do we support our staff? Yes, it's just about helping each other, really, isn't it?
Yeah. So somebody once said ethics is in everything, but actually, as you're speaking, I'm thinking, so safeguarding and mental health, and we need to be safeguarding aware, and we need to be mental health aware, and we also need to be aware of the other things I know that we're not aware of as a society yet, and we will discover that we need to be aware of those too.
Yes.
So anything else on what we can do before, in terms of just being ready, as it were, before we think about what we do when it happens?
And I think the other thing I would just add is around the coach having the supervision.
Yeah.
I think just generally anyway, but I think just knowing that actually whatever that they have got that supervision planned at some point in the future, or they know that if something came out in today's session that I wasn't comfortable about, that I've got someone that I can debrief with.
Yeah, and it's interesting because on the day I saw it happen with a coach that I was mentoring, I was straight on the phone to my supervisor to really just check out with myself, with her help, what to do and how to do it and all those things.
And I just think that is just so important, because again, when there is a safeguarding issue, there will be a number of people who have probably worked with this family at some point, or engaged at some level with this family. And so in safeguarding reviews, it's been very clear that this has happened, and that actually when you look at the number of people, that someone could have done something, and it is sort of going back to no one did anything, but in fact actually anyone could have tackled it, if just one person had just sort of said, actually, I'm just not sure about how that family are coping, or just the behaviour of those parents, or if it's the way that adult daughter is with that elderly lady. There'll be something there, and it's sort of just actually, and sort of going back to ethics, morally, I have a responsibility, as an individual, to actually, not to, just to question, just to question, is there anything I need to do here to check on that elderly lady, that sort of thing.
Yeah. So being human.
Yeah.
I'm very struck as you're talking about that little phrase that you dropped in right at the beginning of this conversation, when somebody said to you, we don't go there, let's not go there. We are humans who are facilitating the thinking of other humans, and what you're saying now is we have to really own our responsibility to be human.
Yes.
Thank you so much. So what do we need to be thinking about next, Nikki?
At the start of the session, obviously, we've gone through the contracting, the confidentiality, and then thinking about, so what happens when there is an issue disclosed? What would the coach do? Do you listen? Just sit and listen, and let the client talk it all through. The thing there would be, it might be of benefit. However, this might have been the first time that individual has been able to talk about it, and you don't want it, depending on what it is, you don't want them necessarily needing to repeat their story.
Yeah.
So I think, again, using the coaching skills to be able to measure that in, actually, when do I just halt the conversation, go back to the contracting around the confidentiality, and check with the individual whether or not it would be helpful for them to, now they've started talking, do they need someone now just to sit and listen to them, but knowing that they're going to have to tell their story, and possibly to somebody else with expertise, or what would that individual like to do with that now? How would they like to talk about it?
So you're saying ask them, and you're also saying that in asking them you might have to have some options available up your sleeve.
Yeah.
So we could stop the coaching now.
Yep.
We could carry on, and we will need to talk about that somewhere. We will need to talk about that at the end. And if this is the first time that you've said this, you may want to talk to someone who's not a coach, who will hold this in a different way. So offering some options. Yes.
And because I think it can be really difficult, can't it? Yeah, sort of when someone does start, or you're doing that coaching session, and all of a sudden, not expecting it, the person bursts into tears. Yeah. It's sort of it's just thinking on those same lines. What would you do? Because to just suddenly halt that and then just get on with looking at time management.
Yes, exactly.
It isn't very helpful
Yeah.
to that individual.
Yeah.
But I think it might be just, actually, do you mind? I just need to just tell somebody about it. What am I going to do? And actually, I don't think I can carry on with this session, because this the disclosure, I suppose, sort of just becomes that focal point for the session.
Yeah, and my belief when we're coaching is that I believe that the person that I'm working with is robust enough to deal with their own stuff. And I'm hearing that's what your belief is. And yet we also need to say to them, so as much as I believe you're robust enough to deal with this, there may be something else that we need to do. So thinking that through in advance sounds like a really important thing. Just a sort of high level wondering, thinking through.
Yes, and I think I remember that from my coaching training. It was around, we're not counsellors, are we?
No.
And it is that knowing, actually, I have to think about what the contract is to have a coaching for coaching, not for counselling, and what my skills are. And I think that's an interesting one. Say, for example, for myself, that actually, if I'm doing coaching, do I have my safeguarding hat on with my safeguarding expertise? Now I might use that to inform me, and I might be more aware of what to do if there was a disclosure. But I feel very strong. I introduce myself as a coach because I'm there for coaching. I'm not there to do safeguarding. So I sort of separate those out quite clearly.
I'm just thinking, things come back into your mind, and which is exactly what we were talking about earlier on in the conversation, those triggers. So I can remember working with somebody a long, long time ago who disclosed during the coaching that they had attempted to take their own life. And I said, what do we need to do now? And he said, the coaching is in the context of my organisation, and I needed to say it in the context of my organisation. And then I said, and are you getting support and whatever? And he was getting support. But it was interesting that it was important to him to have spoken it. But there is something about what's in the past and what's in the present. And of course, in coaching, we are about moving forwards, the kind of so what next kind of space.
And actually, you have using that example. I know I had an experience where the client did talk about the domestic abuse that they were just in the process of getting out of.
Right.
And so, yes, again, it was sort of that I just needed to tell you that, because that makes a difference to how I've been behaving at work, and how I'm responding to the issues that we're discussing around colleagues. That's around and sort of the sort of, and where I go forward. Yeah. So yes. So I guess contextually, it might be useful to the situation, but again, being owned by the client, that I've chosen. I choose to tell you this because it's something in the past, but actually just so that you know where I'm coming from, and that why I might be finding it a little bit of a challenge to move forward. So then it can just move into to what you're there for, I guess.
So those, your example and my example, were both situations, weren't they, where something may need to be named in the conversation, and it's being dealt with well, and it still needs to be named.
Yeah.
So that needs to be that's a different thing, isn't it, from something something historic or something that's not had attention paid to it.
And I think it is a useful point, because I think sometimes if the coach hasn't done the preparation and knowing how they will respond, it can be a bit of a shock to hear that someone has tried to take their own life in the past, or has experienced domestic abuse. Because then you can, being human, want to do something about it. And so I think it's just really when there doesn't need to be anything done about it, because the individual has totally owned that and has got their support in place. It is a problem, but it's not a problem. It's not what they're there for. They just want you to know, that they've been going through that, and they are getting their separate help for that. But just to give you some context, this is what I've been going through.
And they're bringing the parts of themselves from different parts of their lives into the room with you. Yeah.
So it's just the same as if someone sort of says, actually, I'm in the middle of a divorce or something. Yeah.
And I would say, now you've named that here, what do we need to do? And then they'll say, and then the question, and is this being managed well elsewhere? So that's interesting, isn't it? Because that's the duty of care to the individual in the room, which is what I think coaches kind of naturally do that. But we're also talking, aren't we, about duty of care to others?
Yes.
Which is the place where we probably need to increase our ability to engage well.
So that's so that with the coaching relationship, if it's as the coach and the client, but is it just the two in the room? Who else is within that relationship?
Because we're never coaching the individual, even if it's just you and them, are we?
Yeah.
We're always coaching them in their context, in their family system, in their organisation, in the world. Yeah. One-to-one coaching is a myth, I think.
And so therefore, so taking the example of domestic abuse, then yes, so the individual said, I went through a really nasty situation a few years ago. I've got children, but I'm out of it now. It's just but then it's either, and yes, the perpetrator has addressed their problems, and it's been all managed. The police have helped me, various services, blah blah blah. But the other answer might be, oh yes, I had to sort of get away. But no one helped me, and I've and I still have to sort of let my children go and see them at weekends. But yeah, the children didn't witness any violence at all, so I think it's okay. In that situation, again, I don't expect the coach to be an expert in safeguarding, but that gut feeling is, why did you tell me? And actually, are those children safe? Do you think you might need to get some other advice on this to protect your children?
And I might need to get some other advice on it.
Yeah.
That's interesting, isn't it? Because what you're describing there is checking out whether they are connected to another system, to another network. So when you said the example where the police are involved and other people are involved, that's a sense checking duty of care thing that says there are other systems in other places who are offering support here. And then your second one is, I'm noticing that the person in the room is completely isolated and in relation to this situation is not connecting anywhere.
Yeah.
So that's a good testing out thing in our mind, isn't it? So where are we?
So in the session, there's been a disclosure. As a coach, feeling uncomfortable with this, the individual is maybe giving quite a lot of detail, really sort of downloading. So maybe at that appropriate moment, being able to stop that conversation and just check in with them about the purpose, I suppose the purpose of the coaching, but actually what you've told me is outside of this, do we need to stop what we were going to be talking about? Would you like to, how can I help you? How can I work with you to move this forward? Because I think we can't leave it in this space. Something else needs to be
call
done.
that coaching out, Nikki, which is that you beautifully parcel something up and respectfully acknowledge that it's there, and you don't do any work with it because that's not for here, and you do a cracking coaching conversation about where they're going to take this parcel of stuff.
And I think that's very important to maintain it in that coaching context, because it's very easy once someone who has experienced or is always in the middle of experiencing a safeguarding issue, then they might want to just hand it over to somebody else, so that it's on the coach's shoulders, which it can't be. And then for the coach, going back to being human, it's, I must do something, and that's not helpful to the individual. They need to be able to do something themselves and get the right support. So it's checking that they're okay, checking that about others in the outer relationship, and then just in the way that we would within the coaching sort of session, about so that the individual owning it and taking it forward, then how are they going to take it forward around getting action around this safeguarding issue? So if that is it might be that the individuals starts talking about maybe a colleague has sort of said how they have locked their elderly father in the house, they seem to have an awful lot of money, but they seem to have been taking it off their elderly father. It's not for me as the coach. I can't own that. I don't know that colleague. I don't have those details, but I need to know. Now you've told me, I need to know that action is being taken. So then working with that individual as to how they can approach that. So if they're in an organisation, then there should be ways of dealing with that through human resources. There should be a setup where they are able to have that conversation and so for action to be taken. If it was actually, I'm really concerned about my neighbour and what's going on there, and I've seen evidence of some some really sort of serious abuse, whether it be to a child or an adult. Again, it's so I suppose so next time you hear that, what action are you going to take? And so it's trying to so again, as the coach, again, I don't know the neighbour, but I know I'm just hearing it from you. So what do you need to do about this? Because otherwise it is sort of thinking about that sort of going forward and not going back, is that actually you're not going to be able to move forward if you've got this violence going on constantly at your neighbour's house.
And that might sound like, what do we need to do here today together so that you know what you're going to do? Which increases support without taking it onto ourselves. Because in the room we can do what we need to do, but we're not going to take it away.
And I think then it's quite helpful then to around sort of that sort of what taking that ownership of it, and what will you do and when will you do it by, so that it's not sort of, oh, it's okay because I did tell my coach about it, so I've told somebody else, so actually that reduces the concern that I've got. It's being very clear within that session, no, so we've just you need to do something. So you've identified that you need to do something. So when are you going to do it by?
So it's massively tightening up accountability.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I had somebody else once who disclosed that they had wondered about taking their own life. And we talked, and it became clear that they needed to get another kind of support. And I asked them if they knew where they were going to get it. And they said they did. And I said, when are you going to do that? And they said, I'm going to do it on Monday. And I said, and who's got the information that you need? And they told me, and I said, I am going to ring that person on Monday, and I am going to check in with them that you've made contact. And if you haven't, then I will have to take other action.
So certainly sort of around sort of so suicide, there is a lot of there's some helpful training around online now, sort of just around sort of how people can sort of just ask the right questions.
So anything else that we need to think about?
Then I think so around the end of the session, sort of just how how does sort of closing the session and checking how the individual is feeling, so that they're not going off traumatized, and making that agreement, sort of as you sort of indicated just now, around what follow-up that there will be sort of from the coach to the client, so that might be that that's been quite a difficult session. You've cut, there's some actions that you need to do. So is it okay if I just ring you? Yeah. I'll give you a ring on Monday, and just to follow up, just to check that you've been able to do this, because I think it does then give that extra push for the person, that they can't just then go out and put it in a box. Yes. And leave it and then say, well, I did tell my coach.
Yes. So what you're saying is that as much as actually we don't want to be tangled up in their accountability on their time management, and the question about accountability on that is they need to work that, they need to find a place that they'll be accountable that may not be to us. What you're saying, I think, Nikki, is in this context we need to really tighten it up. Yeah.
And I think it's just making sure that they're almost, although it wouldn't be a coach to another system handover, it's just making sure that has been, that there has been that handover to another system, and
Fabulous.
that the individual has taken responsibility for it.
Thank
Because I suppose
you.
it's a bit like if I've had a coaching session and I think, oh yes, I really want to get another a promotion, and then the actions that I've agreed to take me forward in that, and then I don't action them, and then a year later I'm like, well, that was a rubbish coaching session. Thinking, well, actually, so obviously this is just rather more urgent, rather more that because it doesn't just affect who was in the room.
Indeed.
Could have affected somebody else as well.
Yeah. So is there anything else that you want to say to us?
So I think then after the session, I think for the coach to then get some time for themselves to have that debrief, to contact their supervisor, and just and to make sure that they have got that support themselves. And I think the other thing I want to say is just remembering that everybody who comes into the room, an awful lot of people will have had some traumatic experience, and so therefore the safeguarding issue is always there. I think as we've sort of already discussed, perhaps it's growing. If you look at the news, there's always something safeguarding, and so there's a lot of work done about sort of past traumas and how it impacts on people, and so there's a more openness in society to talk about how people have been affected by issues in the past. But we mustn't forget what's going on in the present. And so it's just not being afraid of it, but just not thinking that you need, as a coach, need to take it all on and need to know everything about safeguarding, because you don't. You just need to good coaching skills will support an individual to get the help that they need, I think.
So it's not your responsibility to deal with it, but it is your responsibility to robustly help them work out where they're going to go.
Yeah.
And if they won't go anywhere?
Then that is a challenge for the coach, and that's where it might be sort of thinking about that. I'm going to phone you on Monday to check through this. If the individual is saying no, it's going back to the confidentiality agreement, that actually I couldn't actually commit to full confidentiality, and I feel so concerned about what you've told me that I am going to have to take action on this.
Action or advice?
Or well, advice first, I guess. And then potentially action. I think how I would word it is, look, this might have been really difficult for you to have disclosed this now to me, but you don't seem to be taking responsibility for it, and I know that's difficult for you to do because it's been traumatic. But we can't just leave this issue with us. We need to get more advice. But I think, if you're not going to, then I will, and I will be in touch on Monday, and then we can work through this. I think it's really important to not make the client think that the coach is going to just take it all on. I think that accountability is really, really important, because because what that shows is that the individual who's experienced the safeguarding isn't ready to deal with this, and there's not going to be a good outcome. Really, that they're not going to talk to the services properly. They need to be supported to do it, but they need to be able to talk to the appropriate people about it.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because you've kind of come back to the beginning there, which is to actually say, if the individual isn't willing to do something and something may need to be done, we need to take a decision in service not only of the individual but also of their family, their community, and beyond.
Yeah.
Thank you. Is there anything else that you want to say, Nikki?
No, I think that's it. I think just for any coaches, just don't be fearful of it. Just deal with it as you would with any other situation that actually, and just really around just thinking about that. This, you might be the first person that someone has told, and so recognizing that and listening, and then working out that plan with them about what happens next.
Thank you so much, Nikki. And there's something, isn't there, about have a supervisor, know their number, and also know the helpline number in your country that you need to ring for advice. Yes. Because they will know a load more than you do about how to navigate this, and they're there to help you work out how you can best serve your client.
Yes.
Thank you. So just a question, Nikki. Do you offer supervision to coaches around safeguarding?
I haven't, but would be happy to do that, because I do a lot of supervision generally for those working within safeguarding. No.
How do we contact you if we want to talk to you?
My email address is nicolabrownjohn@gmail.com.
What have been your insights and questions as you've listened to Nikki? And what will you do differently as a result of what you've learnt from this interview? And where will you go to deepen your learning? It's worth taking a moment to think about that. We've talked in this recording about mental health, power, unconscious bias and safeguarding. And there'll be a new ethics special later in 2022 where we will bring you more insights from professionals and coaches. You can use this recording as 3 hours self-study in ethics for your ICF renewal. And if you're doing 3D's full coaching training, you can use it as 3 hours training on the ICF core competencies. All you need to do if you're training with us is pop a short reflection in an email to info@3dcoaching.com and we'll add it to your training hours. If you want to dig deeper into ethics right now, head to the 3D Coaching YouTube channel. That's 3D Coaching with no spaces. And look for the playlist on ethics, which contains links to things that we've found especially useful. Thanks for listening. You can contact 3D Coaching, www.3dcoaching.com, and we're very happy to answer any questions. Bye-bye.
If you've enjoyed what you've heard today, we'd love you to share the podcast with a friend or leave a comment on social media. And if you'd like to become a regular at the Coaching In, you can subscribe on Podbean and all major podcast channels. We look forward to welcoming you next time. You've been listening to The Coaching In, 3D Coaching's virtual pub. For more information, check out 3dcoaching.com.